Harmondsworth, England. April 15, 1943, 2:47 p.m. A deafening roar shatters the Road Research Laboratory as a 2,000-pound steel penetrator slams into the earth at nearly 700 miles per hour. Through the choking sulfur and concrete dust, 19-year-old Walter Grayson staggers from the testing pit, face blackened and ears bleeding. He has just committed a catastrophic error, doubling the drop height and unleashing a supersonic impact that should have ended his career in a court-martial. Instead, he is standing over a 40-foot crater that defies every law of physics his university-educated superiors held sacred. While the Air Ministry dismissed Barnes-Wallace's earthquake bomb as a theoretical fantasy, this uneducated farm kid from Kansas just accidentally proved it could win the war. What the world doesn't know is that the secret to shattering Hitler's invulnerable U-boat pens wasn't found in a textbook, it was found in a massive screw-up. This single mistake transformed a failing project into the Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, saving an estimated 50,000 Allied lives. Today, every modern bunker buster, from the GBU-28 to the GBU-57, owes its existence to the day a farm boy got his math dangerously wrong. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The problem in 1943 was simple to describe and impossible to solve: the Atlantic Wall. From the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire to the V-weapon sites in the French hills, Hitler had encased his war machine in 20-foot thick reinforced concrete. The Royal Air Force was bleeding out, losing nearly 400 aircraft in a single year attacking these invulnerable targets. Conventional bombs, even the massive 8,000-pound blockbusters, merely scorched the surface, wasting 92% of their energy in the air. The expert consensus was unanimous: these fortifications could not be destroyed from the sky. The cost of a ground assault was estimated at 40,000 casualties for a single base. Britain was starving, her convoys hunted by submarines launching from invincible concrete hangars. The war was being lost one invulnerable bunker at a time. The solution would not emerge from the brilliant minds at Oxford or the elite weapons divisions at Farnborough. It would come from a 19-year-old high school dropout who left a failing Kansas wheat farm to find work in a country he barely knew. Walter Grayson was a junior technician, only by the grace of a wartime labor shortage. He was a man with no credentials, surrounded by Cambridge engineers who spoke in differential equations he couldn't grasp. To them, he was a pair of hands to move equipment. To him, they were a reminder of everything he wasn't. But Walter had a farm-bred intuition for how things break under pressure. An intuition that the experts had ignored for 6 months of failed tests. By April 1943, the earthquake bomb project was facing the axe. Wallace's prototypes were penetrating the earth, but they weren't creating the seismic shock waves needed to collapse internal structures. The physics was missing a catalyst. That catalyst arrived not through a breakthrough in the lab, but through the exhausted, soot-stained hands of a kid who was too tired to double-check his dials. When Walter Grayson accidentally doubled the velocity of the April 15th test, he didn't just destroy a testing target. He shattered the scientific assumptions of the 20th century. He proved that the Earth itself could be turned into a weapon. In November 1942, the damp, gray fog of Harmondsworth, England, felt a world away from the sun-scorched, dust-choked wheat fields of Kansas. Walter Grayson, only 19 and lean from years of hauling grain, stood outside the Road Research Laboratory with a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He was a survivor of the Dust Bowl, a boy who had watched his father's farm crumble into debt by 1940 and had crossed the Atlantic in 1941 looking for any factory work that would take him. Through a series of administrative mix-ups and a desperate wartime labor shortage, he had been funneled into government research. He arrived with nothing but a mechanical intuition honed by repairing rusted tractors with baling wire and a profound sense that he didn't belong. On his first day, the reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just in a lab. He was at the heart of Britain's most secretive weapons program. He was introduced to Barnes-Wallace, the assistant chief designer at Vickers, a man with restless eyes and wire-rimmed glasses who spoke of turning the Earth itself into a weapon. Wallace was obsessed with the earthquake bomb. While Walter was surrounded by engineers from Cambridge and Oxford who casually debated differential equations and fluid dynamics, his own formal education had ended at 14. He was a junior technician, tasked with moving heavy equipment, cleaning testing pits, and recording measurements. He felt the weight of massive imposter syndrome every time a senior engineer like Dr. Malcolm Pritchard double-checked his work, their silence broadcasting the assumption that a farm kid couldn't possibly understand the precision required for high-stakes ballistics. By December, the project's central crisis became clear. Wallace explained the brutal physics. Conventional bombs wasted 92% of their energy in the air. His solution was a massive aerodynamic dart that would punch deep into the ground before detonating, sending a seismic shockwave through the soil to collapse internal structures. But throughout the winter, the theory remained just that, a theory. 6 months of testing prototypes had yielded nothing but marginal improvements. The bombs would penetrate 20 or 30 feet, but they failed to create the true earthquake effect. They left impressive craters but left the simulated underground chambers intact. Between January and March 1943, Walter spent his nights quietly compiling test data into organized tables. He noticed something the university-educated minds seemed to overlook: a tiny, recurring pattern. In the rare instances where a penetrator accidentally hit at a slightly higher velocity than intended, the shock zones in the surrounding clay were marginally larger. It was a faint correlation, perhaps just statistical noise, but to Walter's farm-bred eyes, it looked like the missing piece of the puzzle. He wanted to speak up, to mention that impact velocity might be more critical than mass, but the fear of appearing ignorant kept his mouth shut. He convinced himself that if it were important, the brilliant men from Oxford would have seen it months ago. The pressure reached a breaking point in March 1943. Wallace informed the team that the Air Ministry's patience had evaporated. They demanded a full demonstration by April 16, or the project would be scrapped entirely. Dr. Pritchard was livid, noting that they had spent £50,000 and hundreds of tests without a breakthrough. As April arrived, the lab devolved into a frantic 18-hour-a-day marathon. Walter was exhausted, his mind clouded by sleeplessness and the desperate need to prove he belonged. On the morning of April 15, he was assigned to set up the final calibration test. It was a simple task, one he had done a dozen times, but as he adjusted the dials in the dim morning light, his trembling hands were about to do more than just set a parameter. He was about to set a trap for history itself, unaware that the small numbers he was currently misreading were the difference between a minor test and a catastrophic revelation that would change the face of the war. At 6 a.m. on April 15, 1943, the air at the Road Research Laboratory in Harmondsworth was a biting, damp shroud. Walter Grayson had been awake for 22 hours, his nervous system sustained by little more than bitter canteen tea and a desperate, gnawing need to prove his worth. In the dim, pre-dawn light, the testing pit loomed like a great open wound in the earth, a yawning 80-foot drop lined with reinforced concrete, with a simulated underground bunker chamber waiting at the floor. Above it stood the release tower, a skeletal finger of steel that held the future of the earthquake bomb project in its mechanical grip. Walter moved toward the control station, his boots crunching on the frozen mud. He was alone, having arrived early to ensure everything was perfect before the senior engineers arrived. The control panel was a primitive array of black bakelite dials and heavy copper switches. There were two primary controls: the height dial, which moved in 10-foot increments up to 100, and the propulsion dial, which governed the added launch velocity of the test carriage. In the flickering light of a single overhead bulb, the two dials looked nearly identical. Walter reached into his pocket for his handwritten notes. The official procedure manual was locked in Dr. Pritchard's office, and Walter was too proud and too exhausted to admit he needed to see it. His notes were a mess of smudged lead and grease stains. He had done this setup a dozen times, but fatigue had a way of warping memory into a dangerous kind of confidence. 40 feet standard charge, he whispered to himself, a mantra against the cold. But as he reached for the height dial, his eyes skipped a line on his blurred paper. He turned the dial not to the 40 mark but to the 80 at the very top. Then, moving with the rhythmic efficiency of a man who thought he knew his business, he reached for the propulsion dial. Instead of the standard setting used for calibration, he cranked the lever all the way to maximum. He convinced himself the resistance felt right. He convinced himself he was being precise. By 10 a.m., the morning fog had lifted, replaced by the arrival of the Oxford-educated elite. Barnes Wallace and Dr. Malcolm Pritchard walked toward the station, their faces etched with the strain of the looming Air Ministry deadline. Pritchard stopped at the control station, his eyes scanning the logs Walter had prepared. "Everything ready, Grayson?" he asked, his voice clipped. Walter stood tall, masking the tremor in his hands. "Yes, sir. Standard parameters. 40-foot drop, ready for calibration." No one double-checked the dials. Grayson had been so reliable, so invisible, that they simply assumed the farm kid had followed the rules. At 11 a.m., the 2,000-pound prototype penetrator, a 12-foot-long dart of hardened steel, was winched into position. It was a beautiful, lethal object that had cost 3,000 pounds to manufacture, a fortune in wartime Britain. Wallace stood by the pit, his hand resting briefly on the cold steel casing. "If this test doesn't show improvement, I don't know what we'll present tomorrow," he murmured, more to himself than to the team. Walter watched the winch cable go taut, his stomach suddenly doing a slow, cold roll. He looked back at the control panel, and for a split second, the 80 on the dial seemed to glow with a terrifying, silent intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, but the count had already begun, and as his finger hovered over the release switch, he realized that the sound of the wind through the tower wasn't a breeze, it was the ghost of a supersonic scream that hadn't happened yet. At 2:45 p.m., the testing range at Harmondsworth fell into a suffocating silence. Barnes Wallace and his senior engineers retreated into the reinforced concrete observation bunker, leaving Walter Grayson alone at the control station 40 yards from the pit. Huddled behind a heavy blast shield, Walter gripped the radio. "Control, this is Wallace," the crackle came through the speaker. "Proceed with drop on my mark." Walter's heart hammered against his ribs. He had checked the dials once, then twice, his mind a fog of fatigue. "Ready, sir," he replied, his voice thin. 3, 2, 1. At 2:47 p.m., Walter slammed the release switch. Above the pit, the 2,000-pound steel penetrator detached from its carriage. But as it fell, the sound was wrong. Instead of the familiar low-frequency rushing air, a high-pitched, predatory whistle tore through the sky. Walter's eyes darted to the control panel, and his blood turned to ice. Through the soot on the glass, he saw the needles, 80 feet. Maximum propulsion. "Oh God, no," he whispered. He lunged for an abort lever that didn't exist. "It's wrong. The settings are wrong," he screamed into the radio, but his voice was swallowed by a sound that defied nature. At 2:47 and 3 seconds p.m., the dart struck the target at 680 miles per hour, supersonic. The sound arrived before the visual, a catastrophic crack like a lightning strike at zero distance. Then the world simply ceased to exist. A massive detonation pulverized the reinforced concrete, throwing an overpressure wave that slammed into the blast shield like a physical fist. Walter was hurled backward 15 feet, his head snapping against the steel plating as his eardrums ruptured. A debris cloud 100 feet high, a mix of pulverized stone, steel fragments, and black smoke, erupted into the April sky. 7 seconds later, Walter lay in the mud, gasping for air. His uniform was torn to rags, his face blackened with soot and sliced by flying concrete. He couldn't hear the sirens, only a piercing, high-pitched ringing. Staggering to his feet, he clutched a discarded shovel for balance, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning shock. He stumbled toward the pit through the settling dust, looking exactly like the ghost of a soldier who had seen the end of the world. He stopped at the edge. It wasn't a crater, it was a chasm. It was 40 feet deep, nearly triple what they had ever achieved. More importantly, the underground chamber 60 feet away hadn't just been scorched. It had completely caved in, its massive support pillars snapped like dry twigs. This was the earthquake effect Wallace had chased for years. "Grayson." Dr. Malcolm Pritchard's voice finally broke through the ringing as he stormed from the bunker, his face purple with rage. "What the bloody hell did you do?" He grabbed Walter by the collar, shaking him. "You've destroyed 6 months of work. That penetrator cost 3,000 pounds. The Air Ministry is here tomorrow and you've blown the entire target to Kingdom Come." Walter tried to stammer an apology, certain he was headed for a court-martial, but then he saw Barnes Wallace. The great engineer had walked past the screaming Pritchard, ignoring the chaos. He stood at the very lip of the chasm, pale and silent. Slowly, Wallace pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He wasn't looking at the destruction of the equipment. He was staring at the fractured patterns in the concrete with an expression that looked less like horror and more like a religious awakening. As his pencil began to fly across the page, Wallace whispered a single set of numbers that suggested Walter's failure was actually the most important discovery of the 20th century. By 3 p.m., the settling dust at Harmondsworth revealed a landscape of fractured concrete and broken expectations. Dr. Pritchard was still red-faced, his voice a jagged edge of fury directed at Walter. But Barnes Wallace was elsewhere. He moved with a strange, clinical detachment, ignoring the shouting. "Hopkins, get a measuring tape," Wallace called out, his voice cutting through the tirade. "I need the exact crater depth and diameter. Marchant, examine that collapsed chamber. I need the fracture pattern in the support pillars." Finally, Wallace turned to Walter. The boy stood trembling, his soot-stained face a mask of dread. "Mr. Grayson," Wallace said softly, "what exactly did you do wrong?" Walter felt the weight of a court-martial in the question. "Sir, I set the drop height at 80 feet instead of 40. And I set the propulsion to maximum. I was working from memory, and the dials looked so similar in the light." Wallace tilted his head. "So, the penetrator dropped from double the height with maximum propulsion assist?" Walter lowered his head. "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize yet," Wallace countered. "Hopkins' report." From the depths of the chasm, the technician shouted back, 42 feet deep, sir. 61 feet in diameter." Wallace's pencil flew across his notebook. He muttered the variables like a prayer. 2,000-pound mass, propulsion assist, velocity at impact approximately 680 miles per hour. He stopped, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. "We've never tested above 400 miles per hour. Marchant, the fractures?" Wallace demanded. "Sir," the engineer replied, sounding stunned, "the support pillars show compression fractures consistent with seismic shockwave propagation. The failure mode is internal structural collapse, not surface cratering." Wallace went perfectly still. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority, "I need everyone to stop talking and listen." Pritchard tried to interject about damage control for the Air Ministry, but Wallace snapped, "Malcolm, be quiet." In the sudden vacuum of silence, Wallace pointed at the massive chasm. "We have approached this from every angle except the one that matters. This is the first time we've achieved true seismic shockwave propagation through solid material. The only difference is impact velocity. Mr. Grayson's mistake forced that penetrator to hit at nearly twice our previous maximum. The shockwave didn't dissipate into the air, it traveled through the earth like a bell being struck from the inside." Pritchard stammered about the uncontrolled accident, but Wallace cut him down with historical precedent, citing Röntgen and Fleming. He then turned back to Walter. "Mr. Grayson, when you were compiling data in February, did you notice a correlation between velocity and shock?" Walter swallowed hard. "I did, sir. But I thought you all would have noticed if it were important." Wallace looked at his team of Cambridge elites. "We were so focused on penetration depth that we dismissed velocity as secondary. We assumed we understood the problem. You, an outsider, saw what we couldn't because you weren't blinded by our assumptions. But as the sun began to dip, a cold reality set in." "The demonstration is tomorrow," Pritchard whispered. "The pit is destroyed. If we tell the Air Ministry our breakthrough was a technician's blunder, they'll pull our funding for negligence." Wallace looked from the ruined chasm to the terrified farm boy, weighing the cost of a lie against the weight of the truth. He knew the Air Ministry officials were already boarding their trains, expecting a miracle, unaware that the miracle was currently covered in soot and shaking with fear. On the evening of April 15, 1943, the mood inside the Road Research Laboratory was as cold as the English rain. Barnes Wallace stood before his assembled team, his face illuminated by a single lamp. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the wreckage outside, "tomorrow Air Chief Marshal Portal arrives expecting a demonstration of an improved earthquake bomb. We have no functioning apparatus and our target structure is a pile of rubble." A heavy silence followed until Wallace continued. "But we have something better, proof. I intend to show them the crater and explain exactly how Mr. Grayson's error revealed the path to victory. I will tell the truth. Science progresses through accident as often as insight." Later that night, Wallace pulled Walter aside. The boy's face was a map of cuts and bruises. "Tomorrow you must explain your error," Wallace said. Walter's voice trembled. "Sir, I'm just a farm kid. I'm not qualified to speak to the Air Chief Marshal." Wallace gripped his shoulder. "You are the only person who truly knows what happened. Your mistake may save thousands of lives, Walter, but only if you have the courage to admit it." At 10 a.m. the following morning, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal arrived with 3 Air Ministry officials. He stepped out of his staff car and stared at the smoking 40-foot chasm where a testing rig should have been. "Mr. Wallace," Portal said dryly, "I was expecting a demonstration, not a disaster site." Wallace didn't flinch. "Sir, what you see is both. For 6 months we failed because we lacked velocity. Yesterday, a test destroyed our equipment and proved why." Portal's gaze shifted as Wallace called Walter forward. Still in his soot-stained uniform, Walter stood before the highest-ranking officer in the RAF. "Sir," Walter began, his voice gaining strength, "yesterday I made a catastrophic mistake. I set the drop height to 80 feet and the propulsion to maximum. The penetrator hit at nearly 700 miles per hour, twice our intended speed. It didn't just crater the surface, it collapsed the underground chamber 60 feet away. It turned the Earth into a seismic weapon. Portal looked from the 19-year-old dropout to the massive crater. He descended into the pit with Wallace, examining the fractured support pillars of the simulated bunker. He remained silent for a long time, his boots clicking against the ruined concrete. Finally, he turned to Walter. "Mr. Grayson, you destroyed thousands of pounds of equipment and nearly killed your superiors. Normally, that earns a court-martial." Walter went pale, the Kansas wheat fields feeling a million miles away. "However," Portal continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "you also revealed what 6 months of careful planning missed. You had the courage to admit your failure to the Air Chief Marshal of the Royal Air Force. I've decided to let Mr. Wallace keep you on the team. We need people reckless enough to break the rules." He looked at Wallace. "Funding is approved. I want a high-altitude prototype in 3 months. If this works in the field, we'll start production on these tall boys immediately." As the staff cars pulled away, Wallace looked at Walter, the farm kid who had just been given a second chance at history. But as the team began to celebrate, a new, darker question emerged. Could they actually build a bomb that survived the supersonic impact Walter had accidentally created, or would the next test be the one that finally claimed a life? By May 1943, the atmosphere at the Road Research Laboratory had shifted from desperate improvisation to a feverish 16-hour-a-day design marathon. Walter Grayson was no longer the junior technician relegated to sweeping floors. He was officially promoted to technical assistant. His spectacular accident had earned him a seat at the table with the Cambridge elites, who now looked to his data entry logs with newfound respect. Surrounded by the scent of ozone and drafting ink, Walter learned engineering through a total immersion that no university could replicate. He watched as the theoretical earthquake bomb took its physical form, the Tall Boy. The specifications were staggering. The Tall Boy was a 6-ton beast, 12,000 pounds of aerodynamic perfection. It measured 21 feet in length, encased in a hardened steel skin designed to survive the brutal physics of a supersonic impact without shattering. Inside, it carried 5,200 pounds of Torpex, a high-explosive mix far more powerful than standard TNT. It was built to be dropped from 18,000 feet, accelerating to a predicted 750 miles per hour, nearly breaking the sound barrier before it ever touched the ground. Walter's role shifted from manual labor to data analysis. His Kansas farm-bred eyes, used to spotting subtle changes in weather and soil, began to see patterns in the ballistics charts that the engineers missed. During a late-night session in July, he noticed a recurring failure in the casing simulations. "Mr. Wallace," he said, no longer afraid of his own voice, "if we increase the nose hardening by 15%, I think we can reach 60 feet deep before the structure gives out." Wallace looked up from his slide rule, his eyes sharp. "Show me the math, Walter." Grayson hesitated. "I don't have the math, sir. I have the data patterns." Wallace paused, then nodded. "Then let's test your intuition." The modified nose design was implemented the next day. It became the blueprint for every tallboy produced thereafter. In August 1943, the team moved to the Ashley Walk bombing range in the New Forest for the first full-scale prototype test. Walter stood in an observation post, his knuckles white as he watched a modified Avro Lancaster bomber bank into the morning sun at 20,000 feet. When the release command came, the 6-ton dart vanished into the blue. Seconds later, the earth didn't just shake, it groaned. The tallboy struck at 760 miles per hour, burying itself 68 feet into the soil before detonating. The result was a monstrous crater 80 feet deep and 130 feet wide. Seismic sensors recorded a shockwave that propagated through the solid earth for 200 yards. It was a perfect, terrifying success. Production was approved immediately at the Vickers Armstrong's factory in Barrow-in-Furness. Each bomb cost £5,000, $250,000 in modern currency. As the first operational units were crated, the Air Ministry selected the legendary 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, to carry them. But as Walter watched the first shipment leave the lab, he realized that proving the bomb worked on a testing range was one thing. Now these weapons were headed for the most heavily defended concrete fortresses in occupied Europe, and the Germans were already preparing a countermeasure that could render the earthquake bomb obsolete before the first Lancaster even took flight. On June 8, 1944, just 48 hours after the first Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the stakes for Walter Grayson moved from the laboratory to the front lines. The target was the Saumur Railway Tunnel in the Loire Valley, a vital artery through which German panzer divisions were racing to reinforce the beachhead. For 18 months, conventional raids had failed to scratch the 60 feet of solid rock protecting the tracks. If those tanks reached the coast, the D-Day invasion could collapse. Walter had been transferred to RAF Woodhall Spa, the home of the elite 617 Squadron, assigned as a tallboy specialist. On the evening of June 7th, he stood on the damp tarmac, watching the ground crews winch the massive 6-ton darts into the modified bomb bays of the Lancasters. Squadron leader James Willie Tate, a man whose face was etched with the fatigue of 100 missions, stopped beside him. "These bombs better work, son," Tate remarked. "A lot of men on those beaches are counting on them." Walter adjusted a fuse setting, his hands steady. "They'll work, sir. I've seen what they can do." Tate looked at him curiously. "You sound very confident for a technician." Walter simply replied, "I have personal experience with what happens when they hit at high velocity, sir." At 11:35 p.m., 19 Lancasters crossed the French coast. Walter sat in the Woodhall Spa operations room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the crackle of radio static. He listened as Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, flying a Mosquito, dived to mark the target with red flares. Then came Tate's voice over the radio, "Steady, steady, bomb's gone." 4:37 agonizing seconds, the tall boy plummeted through the darkness, accelerating toward the supersonic speed Walter had first discovered by accident. The silence that followed was broken by a roar that could be heard 15 miles away. "Direct hit," Cheshire's voice crackled. "The entire hillside has shifted. The tunnel entrance is gone." The operations room erupted in cheers, but Walter sat quietly, a single thought echoing in his mind: it worked. Reconnaissance photos the next morning confirmed a 300-foot section of the tunnel had collapsed into rubble. The panzer divisions were trapped. A journey that should have taken 2 days would now take 2 weeks. A month later, on July 6th, the 617 Squadron took aim at the Wat 10 V2 bunker, a monstrous concrete dome designed to rain rockets down on London. Protected by 16 feet of steel-reinforced concrete and 20 feet of earth, it was deemed invulnerable to everything but a nuclear strike. 17 Lancasters arrived, and a single tall boy from Pilot Officer Frank Tilley's aircraft punched through the dome as if it were parchment. The shockwave detonated inside, causing the entire facility to buckle and collapse. Hitler's V2 capability at Wat 10 was annihilated in seconds with 0 British losses. Barnes Wallis, visiting the base that day, found Walter staring at the wet reconnaissance prints. "Your mistake in April 1943 just saved 30 bomber crews and destroyed a rocket site, Walter," Wallis said, his voice unusually soft. "How does it feel?" Walter looked at his mentor, his face pale. "Honestly, sir? Terrifying. If I'd known my screw-up would lead to this." Wallis cut him off with a faint smile. "You'd have been too careful to make it." But as they celebrated, a new report arrived from intelligence. The Germans were moving their most prized battleship, the Tirpitz, into a fjord so deep and narrow that even a tall boy might not be enough to find its mark. By November 1944, the Tirpitz had become a ghost that haunted the Admiralty. At 42,000 tons, Germany's last surviving battleship was a Leviathan hiding in the deep shadows of the Norwegian fjords, its massive guns a permanent threat to the Arctic convoys. The British had thrown everything at it: 22 separate attacks involving midget submarines, torpedo bombers, and heavy raids with conventional ordnance. All had failed. The ship's 12-inch thick steel deck armor was designed to shrug off battleship shells, and conventional bombs simply shattered against its surface like glass. Every month the Tirpitz remained operational, the freezing waters of the north became a graveyard for merchant sailors. The final plan rested on 32 Avro Lancasters from 9 and 617 squadrons, each carrying a single tall boy. On November 11th, under a cold, spitting rain at Woodhall Spa, Walter Grayson moved among the ground crews. He watched the winches strain under the 12,000-pound weight of the bombs he had helped perfect. Squadron leader Tony Iveson stopped to observe the loading, his breath misting in the air. "Grayson, you've loaded 200 of these things," Iveson said. "You ever seen one fail?" Walter tightened a shackle, his face set. "No, sir. When they hit at velocity they work. Physics doesn't miss." Iveson nodded grimly. "Let's hope you're right. This is our last shot at her." On the morning of November 12, 1944, the Lancasters completed a grueling 1,200-mile flight to Tromsø, Norway. At 9:40 a.m. they arrived over the fjord. The Tirpitz sat motionless, a gray mountain of steel hemmed in by narrow granite walls. As German flak erupted from the surrounding hills, Flying Officer Arthur Joplin, Iveson's bomb aimer, adjusted his sights. "Bomb's gone," he called. The 21-foot tall boy plummeted toward the battleship's deck, accelerating until it shrieked toward its target at 750 miles per hour. The impact was a mechanical nightmare. The hardened steel casing punched through the 12-inch armor deck as if it were soft lead, detonating deep inside the ship near the forward magazine. A catastrophic secondary explosion followed, a pillar of fire that blew the battleship's bow clean off. Seconds later, Flight Lieutenant Frank Levy scored a second direct hit near the forward turret, triggering another massive internal blast. The Tirpitz began a slow, agonizing list to port. Within 8 minutes, the Leviathan capsized completely, trapping 952 German sailors within its iron hull. Hitler's surface fleet was finished, and Allied shipping losses in northern waters plummeted by 40% in the following months. In the Woodhull Spa operations room, Walter listened to the radio reports through a haze of static. Iveson's voice finally came through. "Tirpitz is capsized. She's gone. Direct hits. Coming home." The room erupted into a frenzy of cheers, but Walter felt a sudden, heavy stillness. Barnes Wallace walked over, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Your mistake just sank a battleship that survived 22 attacks, Walter. Think about that." Grayson looked at the floor, the memory of his explosive screw-up at Harmonsworth now carrying the weight of 1,000 lives. "I'm trying not to, sir," he whispered. 900 men just died." Wallace looked at him with a weary, clinical kindness. "Yes, and thousands of merchant sailors on the Arctic convoys will now live." The war was turning, the invulnerable fortresses of the Reich were crumbling under the seismic power Walter had accidentally unleashed. But as the Allies pushed toward the German heartland, Wallace revealed a new project. A weapon twice the size of the tall boy, a 22,000-pound monster called the Grand Slam. The physics remained the same, but the scale was so immense that Walter began to wonder if even the Earth itself could withstand the impact of what they were about to create. By the end of 1944, the statistics of the earthquake bomb program spoke louder than any laboratory report. Of the 209 tall boys dropped by the 617 Squadron, 182 achieved direct hits or devastating near misses, an 87% success rate that shamed the 4% average of conventional munitions. Most remarkably, the loss rate for the Lancasters dropped to a mere 0.47%. Because of Walter's accident, pilots were no longer forced into the meat grinder of repeated sorties against invulnerable targets. They hit once and came home. In December 1944, a letter arrived for Walter at Woodhull Spa, written on crumpled paper in a shaky hand. It was from an anonymous pilot who had heard the story of the buggered-up test from one of Wallace's team. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," it began, "but I fly Lancasters. My wife's name is Elizabeth. My daughter is too. Because of your balls up, I'm going to come home to them. You saved my life by screwing up. Cheers, mate." Walter folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, where it would remain for the next 48 years. When Wallace found him with wet eyes later that afternoon, Walter admitted the weight of it all was terrifying. "You're not responsible for the war, Walter," Wallace told him. "You're responsible for helping end it." The war's final months saw the ultimate evolution of Walter's mistake, the Grand Slam. A 22,000-pound monster stretching 26 feet long, it took the principle of supersonic impact to its limit. On March 14, 1945, the first Grand Slam struck the Bielefeld Viaduct at Mach 1.2, penetrating 100 feet into the earth before detonating. The resulting artificial earthquake collapsed the entire structure in seconds. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 41 Grand Slams had annihilated U-boat pens and bridges that had resisted years of conventional bombing. At the VE Day celebration, Wallace raised a glass not to himself, but to the man who made the mistake that revealed the truth. Walter returned to America in 1946 with a recommendation letter from Wallace that hailed him as a master of useful mistakes. He used the GI Bill to earn an engineering degree from the University of Illinois and was quickly recruited by the U.S. Air Force Armament Laboratory at Wright-Patterson. His wartime experience became the silent foundation of American bunker penetrator weapons. Decades later, as a 67-year-old grandfather, Walter watched CNN footage of the 1991 Gulf War. He saw the GBU-28 bunker buster. A weapon rushed into production in 28 days using the exact physics he had accidentally proved in 1943. "That bomb works because of a mistake I made," he told his grandson. "The spectacular kind." Walter Grayson died quietly in 1992, but his legacy survives in every GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator currently in the American arsenal. The photograph found in his effects, the one taken on April 15, 1943, showed a battered boy standing in the wreckage of a testing pit. On the back he had written, "The day I thought I'd destroyed everything. The day I actually changed everything." It was the final testament of a farm kid who proved that in the face of invulnerable obstacles, sometimes the biggest breakthroughs only happen when you are reckless enough to break everything. History is written by the victors, but the names of those who actually won it, the ones who stood in the soot and the blood, are usually erased. Walter Grayson didn't have a PhD. He wasn't a general. He was just a 19-year-old kid who lived with the weight of 900 dead sailors on his conscience so that thousands of others could go home to their families. He didn't ask for a medal, and today almost no one knows his name. Are you going to let his story die here? Because every time you scroll past a video like this without engaging, a piece of our history fades into black and white. If you think the courage to admit a mistake is worth more than a dozen university degrees, then hit the subscribe button. Don't do it for the algorithm. Do it to ensure stories of real, messy human heroism don't get replaced by dry textbooks. Leave a comment with the word accident if you've ever made a mistake that ended up changing your life. Let's show the world that failure isn't the end, it's the breakthrough. And finally, like this video. It's the only way to force the system to show this story to someone else who needs to hear it. Walter did his part to save 50,000 lives. All you have to do is click a button to save his legacy. Don't let the farm kid who changed the world be forgotten again.